Criminal liability is an elemental calculus. To secure a conviction, a prosecutor must prove every single element of a specific offense beyond a reasonable doubt. The baseline equation for that liability requires 4 distinct components: an act, an intent, the concurrence of the two, and causation. The physical component is the actus reus. The law demands a conscious, voluntary physical movement. Reflexes, convulsions, or movements made while a person is asleep or unconscious do not satisfy this requirement. If the body moves without the conscious execution of the actor's will, there is no actus reus. Doing nothing can also satisfy this physical requirement, but only if the defendant had a pre-existing legal duty to act. This is the omission exception. That duty must be formally recognized. For instance, a parent has a special status duty to care for their child, mandating intervention. Without a voluntary physical act or a defined legal obligation to intervene, the state lacks the physical basis to prosecute. The second requirement is the mens rea, or the culpable mental state. The Model Penal Code uses 4 tiers: purposely, knowingly, recklessly, and negligently. The common law groups intent into specific intent, general intent, and malice. Without an explicit statute, the Model Penal Code defaults to recklessness. For criminal liability to attach, the rule of concurrence dictates that the guilty mind and the guilty act must happen at the exact same time. The rare exception to this structure is strict liability, where the mens rea requirement is waived entirely. Courts apply strict liability to statutory rape and certain regulatory offenses, prioritizing absolute public deterrence over evaluating the defendant's specific state of mind. Accurately identifying the required mental state dictates whether a death is treated as a tragic accident or prosecuted as a serious crime. For offenses requiring a bad result, like homicide, the prosecution must prove a continuous chain of causation. This means establishing actual cause via the but-for standard. But for the defendant's conduct, the harm would not have occurred. Because infinite liability is unjust, the law imposes a second requirement, proximate cause, an objective foreseeability boundary. Certain intervening causes, like negligent medical care, do not break this chain, as ordinary medical malpractice is a foreseeable risk. A victim's pre-existing physical vulnerabilities are also foreseeable. A defendant must take their victim as they find them. The chain is only broken by a superseding cause, an independent, bizarre event that severs the legal connection entirely. A freak act of nature, like a sudden lightning strike, or an entirely unrelated assault by a third party, supersedes the defendant's original conduct. Proximate cause serves as a policy tool, allowing courts to draw logical boundaries around criminal responsibility. When a continuous chain of causation results in an unlawful killing, the charge is determined by a strict hierarchy. Common law murder requires malice aforethought, a legal term satisfied by one of 4 distinct mental states. The first 2 are straightforward: the express intent to end a life, or the intent to cause severe bodily harm that ultimately results in death. The third is depraved heart murder, an unintentional killing caused by extreme, reckless indifference to human life. The fourth is the felony murder rule, presuming malice if death occurs during dangerous felonies like burglary, arson, or robbery. If malice aforethought is absent, the charge drops to manslaughter. Voluntary manslaughter involves an intentional killing, mitigated by adequate provocation, occurring in a sudden heat of passion. Involuntary manslaughter is an unintentional killing, stemming from criminal negligence or recklessness that fails to reach the extreme threshold of a depraved heart. The distinction between a life sentence and a short prison term relies entirely on proving the defendant's precise state of mind. When evaluating property offenses, the classification of the theft depends entirely on the specific method of acquisition. This slide outlines the common law requirements for larceny, the baseline theft crime characterized by a trespassory taking. It requires taking and carrying away personal property to permanently deprive the owner. As noted, even slight movement satisfies the carrying away element. This next slide distinguishes embezzlement. The key differentiator is the defendant's initial relationship to the property. They use a position of trust to fraudulently convert property they already lawfully possess. False pretenses, defined at the bottom, relies on fraud rather than trespass or conversion. In a false pretenses case, The victim is tricked into voluntarily transferring actual title and ownership of the property. Spotting the correct theft charge requires identifying exactly when and how title or lawful possession transferred. These baseline property crimes can be elevated by aggravators. Robbery is essentially larceny accomplished through the use of physical force or the threat of force. Common law burglary is defined strictly as the breaking and entering of a dwelling at night with the specific intent to commit a felony inside. However, any of these criminal charges can be completely derailed if the defendant lacks the legal capacity to form the required mental state. The insanity defense evaluates the defendant's cognitive capacity at the exact moment the criminal act was committed. This is entirely distinct from fitness to stand trial, which measures the defendant's cognitive capacity later, during the actual court proceedings. Cognitive insanity standards, like the McNaughton test, ask specifically whether the defendant could comprehend the nature or the wrongfulness of their actions when they broke the law. For law students, the strategy is linear. Build your exam answers element by element. If a single link in the chain of act, intent, or capacity fails, the entire criminal charge collapses.